We begin tonight with the loneliest man in American politics at this very moment.
When does my honeymoon period start? I had a big victory. I thought I got a honeymoon period from you guys in the media.
That was, of course, Republican Senate candidate Rand Paul of Kentucky. After a series of, shall we say, rocky interviews following his big primary victory Tuesday night, including one you may have seen on this show, Rand Paul carved out an unexpected niche for himself today as the one man in America who thinks that oil giant BP has really gotten a raw deal these last few weeks.
What I don't like from the president's administration is this sort of, I'll put my boot heel on the throat of BP. I think that sounds really un-American in his criticism of business. I've heard nothing from BP about not paying for the spill. And I think it's part of this sort of blame game society in the sense that it's always got to be someone's fault, and instead of the fact that maybe sometimes accidents happen.
Sometimes accidents happen. That was Rand Paul rising to the courageous defense of a company that has probably managed to displace Goldman Sachs and Massey Energy as corporate enemy number one among the American public right now. A company that's responsible for this image: a live streaming feed of thousands of barrels of oil being dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the political consequences here are sort of obvious, right? I mean, even BP has been smart enough not to roll out the accidents happen excuse. What's more interesting here, though, is who exactly is doing the defending. Rand Paul is a libertarian's libertarian. And the stories that libertarians tell about the free market are that it's a great place where anybody with a good idea can compete, where merit is rewarded, where the best ideas ultimately win out, and where the government just stays the heck out of it. That is the utopian free market of libertarians. But BP, whose honor Rand Paul is now defending, does not exactly represent that utopia. In fact, from a libertarian perspective, the oil and gas industry is one of the most corrupt examples of crony capitalism we have in this country. Some environmental advocacy groups estimate the oil and gas industry, including companies like BP, Shell Oil, and Exxon, receive tens of billions of dollars in federal subsidies every year. These are essentially incentives from taxpayers like you and me to just go ahead and keep drilling. And these subsidies mostly come in the form of tax credits, like the expensing of exploration and development cost credit, or the percentage depletion allowance, or the tax credits for enhanced oil recovery costs. It's all these really obscure subsidies provided to these oil companies from the U.S. government. It's actually sort of the exact opposite of the government putting its boot on the throat of the oil companies. It is the government giving them a handout. And it's not like we need to prop up the oil and gas industry in order for it to exist. The U.S. Treasury Department estimates that removing all of these subsidies for the oil industry would decrease domestic production by less than 0.5%, even in the long run. The very idea of government subsidies runs counter to the libertarian governing philosophy. And yet, when they're in power, when conservatives are in power, reflexively pro-business conservatives have no problem with them. They chuck their supposedly principled free market ideals right under the wagon the first time BP comes calling. In 2005, the Republican-controlled Congress voted to increase tax breaks for oil companies. In 2008, President Bush threatened to veto a Democratic effort to roll back these tax breaks. Republicans right now, as I speak to you, are blocking the effort to lift the cap on what oil companies are liable for when a spill happens. Currently, the money that pays for the cleanup comes from an oil spill fund set up by Congress, another subsidy to the oil industry. This is an industry that lives off of government generosity. And yet, now we have Mr. Free Market, Rand Paul, the purest form of this stringent ideological movement. And what does he do when he gets on the national stage? He defends an industry that is a massive recipient of government welfare. I understand the libertarian urge to defend the honor of the free market and of private enterprise. But is the oil and gas industry, this enormous recipient of taxpayer largesse, really the hill you want to plant your flag in? Joining us now is Danielle Bryant. She's the executive director of the Project on Government Oversight. Danielle, so great to have you here. How are you doing?
It's great to see you, Chris.
So my understanding is that BP is making a killing this quarter. They're doubling their profits, I think, to $6 billion. I guess the obvious question is, do they need this money?
Well, let's keep in mind, this is at a time where every other industry has been suffering, and certainly all of the rest of us have been suffering too in this economy. And for them to be doubling their profits, you have to put that in that context. And then on top of it, you have essentially $3 billion a year in tax breaks. I mean, it's absurd.
Now, is that what is the total cost? I mean, we're talking about the federal budget. You're looking at the subsidies. What kind of numbers are we talking in terms of the level of subsidy that they're receiving?
Well, we're talking really, you get into the tens of billions of dollars. And one of the things that's really important, and I know I'm really a wonk when it comes to the royalties that are paid by the oil and gas industry, but this is,
let's go.
There we go. This is where to do it, right? I mean, this is really important. This is one of the single biggest source of revenues to the federal government after taxes. After the taxes that we pay are those royalties paid by the oil and gas industry for the ability to drill offshore, as we're seeing here, and on public lands. And so this is an incredibly important resource for us, the public, that the industry is now, has been for years, really scamming on.
Right. I mean, the idea is that the oil is essentially owned by the nation, by the U.S. government, and it is a public resource. They pay to extract it. I saw something interesting today about, they pay for all the oil they take out of the ground, whether they capture it or not. Are they going to be asked to pay for all this oil they are spilling? Because
I love that issue. I mean, the question is, this money is being, this oil is being spilled into the Gulf. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be paying royalties on it. We're hearing there is some talk inside the administration of actually requiring that. And I think that's a reasonable expectation.
One of the things I think that's become clear at the hearing when Ken Salazar was on the Hill earlier this week, and throughout this whole thing, is that the relationship between big oil and the government is quite a cozy one generally. And, it's very hard to roll back these subsidies. It does seem like big oil has kind of captured the government. What is the mechanism by that? How does that happen? I mean, how is this kind of symbiotic relationship developed?
There's so many tentacles where you see this in play. I mean, everyone knows about campaign contributions to members of Congress and the lobbyists that are all over Capitol Hill. But there's so many other ways, too. I mean, we've been in hand-to-hand combat with the lobbyists, not just on the Hill, but who are dealing with the regulatory process, where the agencies, generally the Department of Interior, will be, promoting a new regulation, and then it's just covered with people from industry just pounding back to make sure that it's as generous for the industry as possible. And then the other element you have is the former very senior members of policymakers, members of Congress or administrations, who are on the advisory boards of, let's take BP for an example. I mean, you have Tom Daschle, the former Senate Majority Leader. You have the former head of the EPA, Christine Todd Whitman. You have the current CIA Director, Leon Panetta. The Center for Responsive Politics has sort of been amassing all of these people who are incredibly huge power hitters in Washington, who are all
sitting on the boards.
Yeah, of BP, just BP.
Danielle Bryan, Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight. Real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks
a lot. Have a great weekend.
Good to see you. You too.